Great. Welcome again. A very warm welcome to our interactive dialogue titled Rethinking Peace Processes, Doing Justice to the Inclusion Agenda. My name is Hiba Kasas, and I'm the Head of Secretariat for the Principles for Peace Initiative. And it's my pleasure to moderate this dialogue, which we are jointly organizing with Conciliation Resources and the United States Institute for Peace and us here at Interpeace. Thanks to our friends, of course, at PeaceCon for providing us with this opportunity to discuss this important topic. We're very keen for this session to be an interactive dialogue. So we will have 2 rounds of questions to our speakers before we open the floor to our audience for questions and comments and feedback and reactions. We have a great lineup of speakers. I'm not going to introduce them in depth, but I will just introduce them briefly before I ask them their questions. You may find their impressive bio and more details online. But we have one more speaker who's not yet with us, Ilwad Elman, who's going to be connecting from Mogadishu. So we hope that she'll be able to join us soon. But in the meantime, we will start already. So perhaps just to move in and talk a little bit about the topic of our discussion before I move to our first speaker. In order to frame this discussion. From Nagorno-Karabakh to South Sudan to Afghanistan, we clearly continue to witness renewed violence as a result of the repeated failure of peace processes. This is not an abnormality, what we're seeing in different places around the world. This is, in fact, unfortunately, a trend. Research shows us over the years that close to half of all conflicts in the last 3 decades were recurrent. In 64% of these cases, renewed violence is about the very same issues or grievances which were not addressed in peace agreements or peace processes. This reality highlights the fact that a large number of peace processes intended to resolve conflicts have only been successful in reaching what can be described as a temporary cessation of violence rather than in sustaining peace. And of course, there are many factors that can influence the success and failure of peace processes. So what are we doing wrong and what should we do differently? What we'll be discussing today in our session is the focus on heavy emphasis on short-term milestones. We will also be discussing the dilemmas around inclusion and resistance to inclusion in peace processes. So there'll be an opportunity for us to exchange on some of these issues, but of course we are open, since we have a great lineup of speakers, to get deeper in one topic or another, and I invite the audience already to line up your questions as you hear them speak. So with this, I would like to move to our first speaker, Alexander Ramsbottom, who's the Director of Accord at Conciliation Resources. He has a wealth of experience in this field. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspective, Alexander. My question to you, Alexander, and maybe framing it slightly, despite normative commitments and support for the inclusion agenda, peace processes continue to be exclusive affairs, by and large. And we continue to see targeted and pervasive resistance to inclusion. In your latest Accord publication, it looked at the early and pre-formal phases of peace and highlighted the need for long-term engagement rather than the current focus on short-term milestones. What do you think is missing in our current approach to peace processes and inclusion?
Thanks very much, Hiba, and thanks to PeaceCon for the opportunity to be here. And hello to everybody, whatever time it is, wherever you are. So thinking about inclusion in peace processes, I guess it comes across as a kind of critical conversation, that peace processes have really struggled to deliver inclusion in terms of outcomes, which I think is right. I work on peace processes. I'm an enthusiast of peace processes, and peace processes do quite a few things right. But I think inclusion is something that they do struggle with. Peace processes do struggle with, and there's a lot more these days. And Hiba, as you introduced, I work on a publication called Accord, and we look at different peace processes and try and learn from them. And we've just been doing some work on getting how peace processes start and some of the very early phases and what that means for how they then develop further on, and particularly looking at inclusion was one of the big topics that was on our agenda. So just to say a little bit about Accord, in case anyone in the room doesn't know what Accord is and isn't familiar with it. Accord is produced by an organisation called Conciliation Resources, and we're a peace-building organisation, an international peace-building organisation, and mainly we focus on peace programming, and working in partnership with local partners in places affected by conflict. And I mention that because Accord is part of that setup. We're not part of a think tank or a publishing house. We are embedded in an institution that is interested in practice, and we hope Accord is relevant to peace practice, and we include a lot of contributions from practitioners and others with live experience and hands-on experience of conflict and of peace. And then we've had a long interest in inclusion in Accord in lots of different ways, including editorially. We try and walk the talk of inclusion in the stuff that we produce. So we have often quite a large number of contributions from a range of different types of author in lots of different ways, including what their discipline is. We have senior international diplomats through to women's peace activists through to representatives of armed groups. We have quite a range of different perspective. We like to include well-established voices as well as less usual subjects in who we publish. So people coming into their careers, representation from North and South, global North and South, and men and women, and that's very much the case with this latest publication. It's called Pioneering Pathways to Peace. It is on our website and available free, www.c-r.org. So I would recommend you to go and have a look at it. So coming a bit more onto what's in it. I think the dilemma that Heba referred to at the beginning, that peace processes have been much more successful in ending armed violence in those kinds of short-term objectives, armed violence between organised kind of conflict parties, than they have been at delivering a more inclusive or sustainable peace. And I think that reflects a real dilemma. You know, it's a real problem for peace processes. That there is a focus on engaging conflict parties in dialogue in order to end violence. That's a key priority, but that brings with it some restrictions to the other things it can achieve, or it does at the moment, as the way that peace processes are set up at the moment. And so that's something that we've been looking at, and particularly how peace processes start impacts upon how they evolve from there onwards. So in particular, the very early phases of peace processes are often very armed group heavy. You know, they focus on the conflict parties. The main priority is to get the leadership of the conflict parties into dialogue. And the early phases of peace processes are often quite secretive. They're quite closed conversations for valid reasons. You know, there's a logic behind it. But it puts you on a particular kind of track. One of the objectives early on in a peace process, and it's a difficult one, is to draw the conflict parties into dialogue. You know, conflict parties are set up to fight, so they're not set up to talk. And so it's a big emphasis of the early phases of peace process to draw the armed actors in. But then it kind of sets up the process that it's the armed actors that are at the heart of the process. The way into the negotiation table is through your capacity to deploy violence, and a certain type of violence. And that is influential on how the peace process evolves. And actually, I think it's quite hard to change track later on, to inject inclusion later on in a process in a way that is meaningful, is actually quite a difficult thing to do in practice. One of the things is, as I mentioned, that violence is kind of set up as the primary currency in peacemaking. As I mentioned, it's what gets you to the table, and it's what allows you to set the agenda of what the peace process is going to talk about. So non-violent movements or non-violent actors have a different role to play in peace processes, especially early on, and that's part of the path dependence that is set up. And I think one of the things is that there's still a very major focus on single track peace processes. You have a conversation between two sets of armed groups, and that's what's set up at the beginning of the process. And that is the main focus, is to achieve a bargain, between those armed groups where they agree to give up armed violence in exchange for participation in a revised dispensation. That's the core bargain, and that's what the main thing that the peace process is trying to achieve. What that sets up is that other types of violence, perhaps if you want to think about it like that, different types of violence rather than armed violence, so social exclusion or even localized fighting or criminal violence, dealing with those sorts of problems are to an extent secondary to achieving that core bargain. So in a way, I don't think it's a great surprise that peace processes, as they're currently designed, are not great at delivering other types of inclusion, because they're really set up to do one thing. So breaking out of that mold, I guess the question I wanted to leave us with as we move out of I move out of this phase of the conversation is, I feel like this conversation's been around for a while now. How does inclusion become more meaningful? And so I'd really like not to have this conversation in 10 years' time, not to say that there's some easy magic fix to it, but I think it probably needs something fairly radical to happen, or a new way of thinking about it, in order that we are not just going to be trying the same things in more sophisticated ways over and over again, which will make, things are much better now than they used to be. Inclusion is high up the agenda. There's lots of good examples of good outcomes, but still we seem to be hitting a sort of inclusion ceiling when we move particularly into the implementation phase, and things that look beyond the interests of the main conflict parties kind of are liable to fall off the agenda.
No, thank you very much, Alexander. And I think you've put your hand right on the wound when you were talking about none of this is new. None of this is news. We've known this for a long time, that the single track approach, or this heavy focus on the core bargain, would actually in some way or another reward violence and makes that coin to come to the table through violence. But at the same time, we see constant and continuous obsession with this model of negotiations at the table as the main focus for the international community and various actors, and we see an expansion of the mediation space. And I think we've seen in different countries how this has played out, not in the most positive way, but the trick is going to be, how do we actually move from these realizations to actually a shift in behavior and a shift in institutional approach and a shift in how peace processes are conceived and structured. And that's, I think, the collective challenge. And I'd be very keen to hear from the others how they see this challenge. With this, I'll move to you, Yves. Yves Dacour is the former Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross and has recently joined Harvard University Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. Yves, unresolved and recurring conflict have been the main driver of humanitarian imperative, and you have been engaged and have insights both to humanitarian access negotiations globally, but also in the broader sense to peace processes and how their performance is affecting the humanitarian imperative or not. Is the international community effectively engaging the relevant actors, or is there a missed opportunity in the siloed approach that we see in this space? I would also love to hear from you and from your practical experience about some of the dilemmas of inclusion while adhering to international law and the humanitarian principles. Alexander talked about the dilemmas of inclusion in terms of the priority of engaging armed actors, but how did you face that in the humanitarian field?
Thank you very much, Iba. I'm very pleased to be with you. And I must just start with what Alexander said. It's true, I have a feeling it's the same discussions that we had over and over. And I think I must recognize that we as a collective, we are very poor about lessons learning, really. I mean, all that has been already said. I remember very well to had where we were looking at Iraq as again as a terrible situation. There was a report recently, I think 2013, something like that, done about lessons learned about Iraq, what happens and whatever. And then, if I'm not mistaken, 90% of the recommendation, the lessons learned, were already in the report 10 years ago. You know, and you see that over and over, and especially when it comes to peacemaking and peace doing. So there is something about that, as it would forget immediately the lessons learned. Now, if I come back to the humanitarian perspective, as a humanitarian, we are always a bit nervous about peace. We always feel that somewhat peace is extremely politicized, and we have a tendency sometimes to take a bit of distance. But though we've observed a few elements around that. And I think the first element I would like to share is how much the approach towards peace is fragmented, and somewhat how much it is mandate-driven, much more than problem-driven. And that is one of the problems, I think, over time, is we do have in the international community right now quite an amazing portfolio, if you want, of peace actor, from a very classical peacekeeping until mediation, a huge professionalization of the sector over the last 20 years, though extremely fragmented because based on mandate, right? And somewhat a competition between the different mandates to arrive. And as you mentioned, Alexander, as the starting point is a cessation of hostilities, trying at least to contain the violence. And then, of course, what we've seen over and over is then the early time, this moment of cessation of violence, what happens is you have a crystallization of the peace discussions around, in fact, the very same people and the very same group who somewhat have had the monopoly of violence, or at least were exerting violence. And then peace is trying to integrate these people to be then the leaders of peace. I mean, the most classical example we know very well is South Sudan. I mean, if you look at all the work that has been done for the peace, and then all the work around South Sudan, and if you look at today, we see the very same leaders that were the leaders during war and during violence. And of course, when you do that, you create an incentive for the other actors to say, oh, violence works much more than anything else. And it keeps you in power. So I think there is something around that where at the beginning, the containment of violence, which makes sense, but the fact that we decide that the containment of violence and the actors that are exerting violence should also be the one who are central to peace is seeing a systemic issue, right? And a systemic problems and systemic failures. We see that again in Afghanistan and other places, which for me as a humanitarian has always been a problem. And of course, the fragmentation of the peace actors doesn't help, which makes in fact something very difficult. If you just add on then the development actors and then the humanitarian actors that you mentioned, three, what happened is you have an overload of external actors of the context itself. And that has always been something which I would be very worried about. All the peace agreement and all the peace work done. It is very, very, very driven by external actors, and most of them mandated. And I think that is one of the big difficulties. And then we come back to Alexander's questions, is how do we then include, in fact, the society, the different part of the society, and most importantly, how do we start to really discuss about what are the real issues, the root cause, the grievances. And this is maybe one point I just want also to point out is I've seen in a lot of contexts where I've worked, in fact, the real issue not being addressed, the grievances, the fact that one part of the population was dehumanized towards the other, that the us collectively was a very narrow us, and then was suddenly represented also when you talk about peace agreement. And there was no ability to bring a larger us. And last but not least, and not a surprise for you, is, and it is very difficult right now, is you can't do that if you have a short-term perspective when it comes to peace. You can do that when you do containment of violence and cessation of hostilities, yes, but it's no way. And again, and that's maybe our problems also as humanitarian. You can't think Afghanistan 30 times 1 year. That's crazy. It is what we do. Our funding, our vision is always related to something short, because this is how the system works. You never ever think long term, and you never ever you are not able to somewhat look at that. Look at the mandate even of the peacekeeping. When they have a mandate, it's a very short mandate most of the time. It's a mandate which brings a lot of different objectives. So all that makes it very difficult. So to answer your question, yes, we have a problems about bringing the right actors around the table. Yes, we have a problems, I think, with a fragmented and very siloed approach, though we do have means to be able to do something different. And yes, we have problems to somewhat integrate a larger perspective and a larger numbers of people. And one of the reasons is because we think short term. That's very clear. Your last question, which is about principle. Yes, I feel, but again, I'm not an expert in the peace questions. I feel that we are lacking some principle. If I try to relate to the humanitarian world, what is very powerful is to have the same grammar. You can be very different actors, you can have different perspective, but you understand what is the collective grammar. I would ask, for example, two elements which are central. The famous impartiality. Yes, as a humanitarian, you are not really a humanitarian if you're not able to be impartial. And then you can discuss, are you impartial or not? And in Afghanistan, for example, that was a huge question for the United Nations, for example, at some moment where they were not allowed to engage, for example, with the Taliban for quite a while. And of course, being not allowed to engage with the Taliban means that they were not able, in fact, to help and support a number of people that were controlled by the Taliban. So impartiality is a central perspective, for example, as a humanitarian. I'm missing that when it comes to peace. I'm missing some principle that will help us collectively to go, again, through the famous mandate and to be maybe more problem-based. And then whatever the actors are, have a clarity about what we want to achieve. I know in the ideal that we should have a Geneva Convention for peace, right? I love the Geneva Conventions. I come from this world, which are able somewhat to be this famous common grammar that you can relate to when you fight and when you are the people and you can refer to it. I don't think the time is ripe now to create the Geneva Conventions for peace, though at least a set of principles that will help us to move forward, that would be something which I would really looking forward to be able to do that. And I think we should be in a position to be able to do that.
Thank you so much, Yves. I think it's these are very powerful words, and I was also struck with the points you were talking about the inherent flaw in mandate-driven rather than problem-driven interventions and how we see them on the ground. And I can relate to that in many of the previous roles I've held, both in the humanitarian but also within the peace and security space. And as a previous head of agency, the UN, and having sat in humanitarian country teams and then working at the regional or global level, it always struck me to see how you could literally remove from a humanitarian response plan, or to that matter, a stabilization plan, you could literally remove the name of the country and remove the context analysis, and all of the plan is exactly the same. It's the same sectors, it's the same interventions, and that's a strong manifestation of this problem that we are mandate-driven. When you're a hammer, everything you see is a nail. There's a question of incentives and mandates and the kind of pressure that you face as a representative of an organization whose mandate is children, or whose mandate is women, or whose mandate, and everything you push for in these humanitarian response plan is the usual toolbox that also support your mandate. And I think you're right with what we continue to see, that interventions that are not based on an understanding of the root causes of the conflict and the related dynamics can not only lose an opportunity, but in many cases, actually, they create harm. So there are a lot of moral and ethical considerations to kind of revisit our approach. And there's an urgency to rethink the toolbox. And I think that, your call for principles or common grammar, I think is a very, very powerful one. And I think that is a really great segue to go back into the issue of inclusion, because I think that's a broader discussion. I don't want us to lose it. We'll zoom in a little bit more on inclusion, but then perhaps we'll take this topic again. Now moving to you, Isra. And Isra is a senior expert on inclusive peace processes and reconciliation. She's the author of the recent USIP study, Understanding Resistance to Inclusive Peace Processes. Isra, your research finds that resistance to inclusion continue to take place in the majority of peace processes. What forms of resistance did you observe in your study, and what tactics have different groups used to overcome resistance to inclusion?
Thank you, Hiba. I'll try to answer the first part of the question in the first round, and then deal with some of the strategies that are used to overcome resistance in the second round. So I'll continue from where Alexander left, actually, and I try to approach this question from basically asking this main question that we have: why isn't the inclusion agenda moving forward? Right? What is going on? So I decided to, in this USIP sponsored research, 2018. I decided to look into the underlying dynamics of resistance to inclusion. So this research looks into patterns of resistance to inclusion, who tends to resist, why, what motivates them, and what kind of tactics they use to resist. And for this, I gathered a data set of about 80 incidences. It's like an event data, 80 events of resistance in peace processes, in different peace processes, more than actually, we examined more than 43 peace processes, mostly existing in the inclusive peace data set. So resistance, the idea is that resistance comes in different forms. This is the general idea of the report, from different actors. And these actors use different tactics. So the main idea in the report is that we need to really have a good classification or typology first in order to have a more nuanced approach to tackle resistance. So I argue, and I shared the link here in the chat box if you want to look at the research report in more detail. If we cannot deal with different types of resistance with the same approach. You mentioned having a hammer and seeing everything as a nail, right? So basically, I'm suggesting that this is not going to work. Okay, so let me say I have actually some slides and tables to show you here, and I'll try to share my screen with you. Please let me know if this is working. Just a second. Not yet. I'm not very familiar with this.
We still have a black screen, Isra.
Okay, I'll try again. Just a second. Let's see if it will work now. Okay. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Not really.
We can see. We could see your computer screen with.
Can you see the slide now?
No, we cannot.
Huh?
No, we cannot.
You can't. All right. Maybe I won't do this now. I tried doing this earlier and it worked.
We have a message here that you could select the application window only, not the entire screen.
Okay, that's what I did. I select the application, and then I click desktop share. Oh well, okay. I don't think it's gonna work. Sorry, it doesn't work like Zoom. All right, I'll move on. I can.
We're happy to hear you, Isra. So you can share your conclusions, and that should do.
Okay, so the first thing, let me say that I take a different look at inclusion here, mostly relying on what inclusion means in social psychology and defining it as a fundamental human need, which results from these two basic needs: the need for belongingness, and need for distinctiveness. And I discuss, actually, I had this table, but I can't show you. I discuss how meaningful inclusion will differ in this sense, because it is an optimal balance. It strikes an optimal balance between these two fundamental human needs. So it maximizes high belongingness, but it also maximizes high distinctiveness, these two needs. All right, so in this report, we define resistance to inclusion as the behaviors of particular people or groups that undermine the successful design or implementation of an inclusive peace process. And mainly we identified two types of resistance. What I call as targeted limited resistance, and the second type, pervasive resistance. And these are very different, actually. The targeted limited resistance usually takes place, either opposing the participation of a particular group or individual, or it is limited in a particular time period in the peace process. Whereas pervasive resistance is embedded, and it usually goes throughout the peace process. It is very much embedded in the system, and you tend to see in pervasive resistance that resistance to inclusion comes from the same type of actor throughout the process. And it is also very much embedded in these legitimizing cultural, ideological myths that are that exist in societies. And you can take a look in the report that pervasive resistance, we see it in the negotiation phase, in the codification phase, and in the implementation and the materialization phase of a political settlement, all throughout. Whereas targeted resistance or limited resistance, we tend to see it in one phase, and then it sort of dissipates. When looking at the sources, like who resists, who tends to resist, but in about 60% of these events that we examined, the resistance comes from the power holder elite. In the rest, we see that it sometimes comes from rebel groups, armed groups. And in about 20% of the events, it comes from societal actors or social groups, social movements like ethnic, religious groups and their societal basis. You asked about the tactics, Hiba. So looking at the tactics, I divide them into three, and I have observed these tactics in three groups. The first one, I call it implicit resistance. This is very difficult to really see. It's not really visible. It operates like implicit bias in a way. So these are unconscious acts of resistance due to automatic reactions, and people even are not necessarily aware of these. And then the second type of the second set of tactics, I call them explicit direct resistance. This is the most common category of resistance tactic. This involves intentional use of explicitly hostile and competitive tactics, short of violence, but they're also used in a very manipulative way. So oftentimes, for example, you see these kinds of resistance tactics within an inclusive process. So it looks like it is inclusion, but you see there is this manipulative process going on to resist inclusion under disguise, in other words. And these tactics resemble very much like everyday resistance tactics in that they're less forceful, less visible than coercion, but they're very manipulative, duplicitous, as I said, towards an inclusive process. And we can talk about 5 different types of these kinds of this kind of resistance. Sabotage is used often. that is blocking the access of people to an inclusive process or to sensitive information. Another type I call is false compliance, which is about really, agreeing to an inclusive process, but trying to control it fully, or controlling who will be in the inclusive process, or inclusion is supported as long as it abides by the boundaries drawn by the elites, for example. The other type I call is foot dragging. So even though there is an inclusive process going on, actors use all sorts of delaying tactics, neglecting tactics, failure of implementation, etc., to foot dragging. Another type I call is speech acts. So an inclusion agenda can be securitized by some actors. So inclusion attempts are framed as a security threat, for example, in the public rhetoric, and that is another type of resistance tactic. And the last group of tactics, I call them coercive tactics. This is basically use of violence towards certain groups, physical violence, threat of violence, vandalism, etc. And I don't have a lot of time to go into examples and details, but let me just say this and end. When looking at the motivation, what motivates these groups to resist inclusion, we see that actually the main dynamic that is going on here is, and I think it was Eve or Zand that mentioned social exclusion. The main dynamic that is going on here is, especially in pervasive resistance, is that some of these societies are very much hierarchically structured. There's a very strict social hierarchy. And when the inclusion agenda is pushed, these groups that have the dominant group status, they perceive a threat, and they react to losing. They react in all sorts of different ways to losing their privileged group status. So that is actually a very common sort of dynamic that we see in pervasive resistance. But other than that, we also see like economic motives. The dominant group sometimes fears the loss of economic privileges rather than more like identity or status privileges. And some in targeted limited resistance, we also see political competition, reluctance for power sharing. A political threat is often used as well. I'll stop here, but I would, as I said, I shared the research report, which is more detailed with a lot of examples in the link. So let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Esra, for sharing all the findings, also from your recent research, which I found really powerful. I mean, in reality, as you said, we see that peace processes often fail to engage even all the relevant elite actors, let alone the women or youth or other actors that should be also engaged. And I think one of the key things that struck me over the years is how vivid and clear the absence of women in peace processes is. It's often the most visible manifestation of the exclusivity of the peace process. I very much also appreciated your point about the tactics of sabotage that we often see in different cases, and there's so many anecdotes to share. We'll see if we have time and we can talk about some of the examples of sabotage that we've seen in different processes. But I'd be also keen to hear from Alexander and Eve about their ideas within this framework. But I think ultimately one of the key takeaways from listening to you is a reminder of the structural barriers to inclusion, that there is indeed a missed opportunity in engaging some of the strong constituencies that can actually be part of the solution, that are in favor of peace. And then it takes me back to the points that were made by Alexander and Eve, that this approach of centering the heavy emphasis on the model of negotiations around the table, in a way, is breaking a lot of these or losing a lot of these opportunities, where it enables these modalities of resistance to inclusion rather than opening in avenues of participation and moving to a more multi-layered and complementary processes that would open avenues of participation and engagement. It's always easier to identify what's broken, and it's always harder to talk about the solutions and what does work. So my second round of questions to you is to try and discuss some of these. And I'll start with you, Alexander. What are some of the innovations, including new technologies that can help us increase inclusion, both early and later, and at later phases of the peace process? And also what needs to change so that these innovations are actually considered and adopted?
Thanks very much, Eva, and thanks, Eva and Esra as well. Really fascinating presentations. And Eve, just to pick up on a couple of things you said. I was because Eva's obviously interested in peace principles, and you mentioned the whole thing of principles, and I think that's quite an interesting area as well of what you do in the fighting phase that affects how you come out of fighting, because fighting's still about sort of victory, most of the time military victory over another side, and maybe should be some principles about that, about what you're fighting for, and are you fighting for some other kind of outcome rather than victory. So how you behave in war impacts how you come out of it, because that whole phase of how you set up, of how you fight, makes a massive impact on what you can do after it. The whole thing of sort of labeling people as terrorists or really, really prevents you having a different kind of relationship with them as you come out of fighting. So I thought that was really fascinating. And then I think just to remind ourselves as well that ending armed violence isn't a bad outcome. It has a massive humanitarian impact, and it's difficult. And I think the world has got better at doing that. I think that part of a peace process is we've got to remember that's really hard to do and is important. And so the challenge is, how do you get more inclusive alongside that? Not to just chuck out the baby with the bathwater, which I think is the real sort of essence of the challenge. So just to pick up on some ideas about potential solutions or avenues to increase inclusion, and particularly looking at the kind of early phases. One of the things that we looked at was working with an armed group, sort of working from the inside of this sort of problem, working in an armed group. First off, quite a traditional thing is supporting an armed group to sort of move from the battlefield into the dialogue space, which is in itself is a really difficult thing to do. They're not, as I think I mentioned in the previous presentation, particularly non-state armed groups, they're not really set up to do that. They've spent a long time in the fighting in whatever circumstances they're under, and having a more sort of nuanced approach to what their objectives are that they could achieve through dialogue is a real problem. So accompanying an armed group through that process is something that's quite familiar peace practice. That's quite a big part of what peacemakers and peace organizations do. But it's possible to make that process itself more inclusive. We feature a write-up of some experience that CR has had working with the Ogaden National Liberation Front in Ethiopia in their attempts over many years to get a successful negotiation with the federal government in Ethiopia. That process was complicated by the fact that the leadership of the ONLF were in exile. A lot of the mid-range fighters were in exile. There was quite and it was a very closed space for a lot of the actual Ogaden region of Ethiopia. It was a closed space which was hard to get into. But what CR tried to do and work with the ONLF to do was to engage in different types of dialogue with communities that the leadership could engage with. So diaspora communities, refugee communities, these types of people, which has quite a profound effect, I think, on the getting at the dialogue process itself. Once you get that moving, you've got some form of input from different types of voice and different types of perspective and different type of need into the leadership of the armed group. Some of which is quite critical of the armed group itself. You know, there are hard conversations, and that's something that I think that's really important for the unarmed group to think. It's not this purist representative of all of the grievances, but at some stage it is part of the problem amongst its own constituency as well. So that's a really important part of the conversation. And then some of the more excluded communities have a way to raise their profile within that particular group itself, you know. So some of those conversations were really important, and I think it provides an armed group as well with another type of political leverage outside of violence. You know, they do have a more political representation of a whole constituency, which is important for peacemaking itself, but also as you move out of peacemaking after a peace deal into implementation and into non-violent politics. And one of the things actually that was quite interesting about that also was that some of the people, because it was the transition itself was quite big once the peace deal happened in 2018, some of the constituencies that the ONLF leadership engaged with pre-peace agreement actually became quite powerful actors on the government side post-agreement. So it actually helped with having a much more inclusive process after the peace agreement as well, because some of the relationships with some of the resistors to inclusion or some of the different types of elites were actually established in the negotiation phase over many years, and that actually helped in the implementation phase to open things out a bit. So that's a particular example of one type of engagement with an armed group that can happen in that early phase, but I think it has lots of potential. Another way I'll stick with the armed group theme as well, actually. So another thing that we looked at also is doing subnational peacemaking in some of these environments, and particularly in Afghanistan, which Eve was talking about early on. And actually, for quite a long time, there have been lots of examples of different types of peacemaking at a subnational level in the different districts of Afghanistan. And today too, you know, there's quite a lot of things happening, either quite narrow conversations about reductions of armed violence, or even sort of temporary ceasefires, these kinds of things, which have humanitarian benefits and lots of other positive aspects to them, but also some examples of deeper types of accommodation and peace deal as well. And that's, I think, important in a number of different ways, not least that who knows whether the sort of track one peace process in Afghanistan is going to go, for example, and how long that's going to take before we get to the magic peace deal when suddenly everything will be okay on the other side of it, you know. And meanwhile, levels of violence are very, very high, and no necessary reason to think they're going to get lower. So establishing some local peace has its own value in that kind of way. But it also, and this is quite a controversial part of it, I think, it can have some different type of pressure on the Taliban leadership, you know, that so some internal upwards pressure saying there is desire for peace from within your movement, you know, and there is examples of where cooperation can happen in these localized areas. Otherwise, I think a risk is that a leadership of a group like that has very free rein it needs to do work to maintain its constituency, but when it comes into sort of negotiations and peace negotiations and that kind of thing, they have quite a free rein to sort of dictate the terms of it from a leadership perspective. So anything that pushes stuff up from below towards the leadership, and it has an impact on inclusion, I think, and an impact on the type, first off, their willingness to reach some kind of deal, but also what goes into the deal as well, because people have different ways of getting their voice into that process. So those are a couple of little examples of working with armed actors in those situations. We have lots of other examples of working sort of outside of the main conflict parties as well to try and get more traction in, including through sort of technology and social media and those kinds of things, which are really interesting spaces to open up to different types of voice, and we've got some really good examples of that as well. But I think I'll stop here and hand over, and we can come back to these things later on.
Thank you very much, Alexander. It's really fascinating to hear your perspectives around engaging armed actors. And I'd be interested to hear from others as well around the challenge, the collective challenge in moving beyond armed actors and moving beyond the usual suspects. I mean, over the years, we've heard so much emphasis around the inclusion agenda. There has been a lot of advances at the normative level, for example, the Women, Peace and Security and Youth, Peace and Security. But there is a large margin of tokenism and box ticking. And I see one of our participants online is actually talking about box ticking and asking questions around that in terms of how you've seen these examples. Where we say, okay, now we're opening the space for women, so let's bring two women to be part of this process, or rather than looking at strategic inclusion of how can they actually meaningfully engage in which processes. So I'd be really interested to hear on how we actually can broaden the frame of reference. How can we move in terms of solutions of thinking of strategic inclusions at different parts of the peace processes or the processes of building peace rather than the political process only. But with this, maybe this side note, which it would be good also to hear your perspectives on. Eva, I'll add a couple more questions just to make your life a little bit more difficult to answer so many points. What could be your key messages on what should change in the international community's approach so that peace processes are more effective and inclusive? We've heard a lot of points that were made by you and by Alexander and Esra. But from your experience, can you share some of the do's and don'ts? Is it time to rethink the toolbox, for example?
I'll do that in 2 minutes. That would be perfect. No, I'm just joking because
you can do that in more than 2 minutes.
It's so complicated and there's so many things. I think let's start with one good news and then maybe problems. The good news is I still feel that there is a lot of people, resources also dedicated and willing to be dedicated to peace. We just need to harness it. So I don't think it's so much about having more resources than to use these resources smartly. And maybe just one remark and then maybe some do and don't. The first one is really a remark of what Alexander said about violence. And I think what I've seen in a lot of contexts as a humanitarian, what is difficult is as long as violence is the main currency of power, that is super complicated then to enter in any peace settlement, right? You can maybe contain that. You can somewhat diminish about the level of, the value of violence as a currency. But if you're not able to do that, then you are in a very difficult situation. And maybe the first thing to really reflect is when is the moment where you create an incentive where violence is not anymore the only currency. And here I just would like to flag an idea, which is territory and people. My experiences in dealing with a non-state armed group or let's say stakeholder, right, that are dominating an environment with violence, they have one normally, let's say leverage or less interest. It's still the territory they occupy and the people they control. After a while, they still need to take care of them. We can argue what take care means in Afghanistan or in Iraq or in Syria, but still they have to do something about that. And if you look at civil war, most of the civil war are about, in fact, taking control of the people, right? Very deeply around that. So I think when we think about leveraging, it is exactly what Alexander says. We have to be able to create a dynamic that allows somewhat the voice of the people. I'm not saying he's in a naive way, but the voice and also the fact that people are numerous and their needs start to be taken into consideration in the peace. And not just in a classical humanitarian setting. So we've been able to find deal with the Taliban, for example, as an organization, the ICSE, based on the fact that they control territory and they want part of the population under their control, having access to water, access to health, and we were able to do that. We have to somewhat integrate that notion also when we do peace, to bring, in fact, the needs of the people into the equations, but not just us, the external actors, but the people themselves, right? So maybe the first do is recognize that violence is the main currency in a lot of context, and how do we shift, in fact, this main currency? I think is an important element because it will help us then to design a different set of peace. Yes, you have to have a cessation of hostilities, of course. Yes, you have to, at the beginning, put at the table the people, the leaders who are controlling these groups. Absolutely, that's very clear. Though we all know that is not enough. So I think there is very quickly a moment, and maybe that's a second do. If we're able to think long term, and I think here when we talk about peace, we have to talk about decades. I know people will freak out, but we do have to talk about at least a 10-year perspective, let's say, at least. And we all know it will not be 10 years, it will be 20 or 30, but let's say 10 years. And if we would have a 10-year strategy, immediately you can then start to integrate the fact that you're doing a cessation of hostilities, but after a while, you are bringing already some other element of peace, which are very important. You know, you could have the very positive element of peace. You can integrate much more. You can really have a strategy and a certain dynamism around the 10 years, right? And last but not least, if you also then start to, in fact, put your resources along the 10 years, that starts to be a much more interesting, with indicators of success, that might be a more interesting perspective that will allow us, and that's my third point, to have a common grammar and common understanding of what are we doing. One of my concern, and here I would like to bring again Afghanistan, it's not the only place, but it's interesting. The way Afghanistan was sold to the larger public by the Western power, if you want, and the international community, so-called, was a real issue. You know, kind of, okay, we will arrive, there will be peace. Let's bring the leaders together, and then let's have an elections, and that's done. You know, we're not done. I think there is really, I think we need also to, not just for the local people and the people that are directly involved, but I think for the international community, for the citizen, for the people who are watching this kind of issues, we have to start to have a change of discourse, saying it's a 10-year commitment, and this is our expectation, and this is what we will do, and this is how much we are ready somewhat to look into that. That will create a different element, and it will create a different narrative, right? And I think it's an important element. So the famous common narrative, and I would add a common grammar with possibly principle. I'm deeply convinced that we need to have principle and somewhat an agreed principle about when we start really and when we move from cessation to hostilities to peace, really settlement, we need to have a common set of grammar and set of principle that will help us. Last but not least, in terms of or at least of things that I've experienced, is all the questions of integrating. I think we heard that, and I think Esra, your report on inclusion is super interesting. We need, there is no questions, to bring category of people. Then we've learned about it. The women, the young people, also the youth, are systematically outside of any of this equation. So we need to find a way to be really explicit about our inclusions and how it works, right? And I think that is a critical element. And my final note, you will never be able to do that if the peace, let's say, strategy is externally driven. You need to have external actors. You need to have an internal coalition, for sure. That helps, but it needs to be internally driven. And in that case, we have to rethink also the way the mandated organization are playing. I mean, you can't just have this kind of rush of all this organization moving into peace with sometimes very strange mandate and competing mandate, and they will be the one who in fact are leading and somewhat bringing the resources and sucking the resources. So I think reflecting of what could be an internal lead, and a complex dynamic lead is central. So if I summarize in 1 minute, is really time frame central for me, is because it will allow then to have a strategy that is moving beyond the cessation of hostilities, is really reflecting about how do we recognize and acknowledge that violence is a currency, but how do we shift that over time? And it's very clearly integrating, talking about the roots, problems, root cause, the grievances. And the only way to do that is to guarantee that we do have an internal, a local, a national lead, and that the international is supporting, holding accountable. And last but not least, common grammar. That will be very useful. Common narrative about what we expect over time, but also common principle. That will be really, really good.
Great, thank you very much, Eva. I think you've given us almost a program of action that should keep the whole Peace Caucus busy for a long time in order to shift a lot of these issues. But I think it's very important. I think you summarized it, so I'm not going to attempt at it because it was beautifully summarized. But with that, I'll move directly to Isra. Isra, from your research and from your wealth of experience, what do you think must change so that resistance to inclusion becomes the exception rather than the norm? And what are the changes different stakeholders in a peace process have to make to do justice to the inclusion agenda?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll repeat what I said in the beginning as a general principle here. Again, I think we need a more nuanced approach to deal with resistance to inclusion. I don't think we can deal with implicit bias kind of resistance the same way as we deal with more, as I said, systemically embedded ideological or cultural type of resistance. So we need to be aware of these differences, and raising awareness is, I think, the first step that we can do. So, for example, a lot of times under the disguise of inclusion, what we see is these manipulative use of power of the elites. And we need to actually educate and train mediators, participants, everyone in the peace community about how it is likely that we see these traits when, and how do you recognize them, and what can you do? What kind of things you can do in the design of a peace process to prevent them? So one thing that I observed, for example, is when you're setting decision-making procedures, okay, is very critical. One thing that I observed in a lot of cases is, for example, deadlocks or inability to reach a decision, and deadlocks are they serve as perfect opportunities for some people to take over and hijack the inclusive process and sort of unilaterally push for their agenda. So can we do something in designing a peace process to avoid deadlocks? Can we, for example, come up with decision-making procedures, rules that could avoid deadlocks, for example? So there are some things that we can do in the short term and in the medium term, like these decision-making rules, procedures, etc., or incentives. Or another thing that I discuss is maybe having an inclusion compliance ombudsman, etc. There are all sorts of things that you can sort of build into the process like these. But I will go back to the time frame issue, which is critical, I think, that Eve mentioned. This is not going to be enough. I think we still have to confront the fact that there is pervasive resistance, and we need to expect that. So I don't think we should be, we like this norm, but I don't think we should be naive about it. We need decades and decades to transform these centuries of relationships in some places. And we probably should always remember that we're upsetting years of power relations when we introduce our inclusion agenda in a peace process, and it's not just going to change overnight or in a couple of years. Nepal is a good example in this sense, right? You have a societal code, you have these hierarchical social religions that have been there for years, for hundreds of years sometimes, and it is very likely that you will meet resistance from certain groups, certain social groups. So I think we really need to be thinking about peace processes politically as well as venues of political struggle. Sometimes I think we are being too technical, and we sort of, as peace practitioners, and we tend to disregard this political aspect. And I think in this sense, introducing or synergizing nonviolent action, civil resistance as a strategy with negotiation, mediation with other tools that we use in a peace process is critical. This is something that we're working on at USIP at the moment. In some of the examples that I looked at, civil resistance, for example, was used as a strategy to overcome this kind of pervasive resistance in the long run. Sometimes it was successful, sometimes it was not, and we need to understand that better. When does this work to overcome this kind of resistance to inclusion? So that is an issue of time frame again. There are things that you can do in the short term. There are things that you can deal with trainings and awareness raising, but there are also things that will take decades and long-term thinking, like dealing with this kind of pervasive resistance, changing the culture, changing these sort of hierarchies. And I think the other thing that we need to think more in our peace practice community is we need to be thinking more about inequality as a concept. That is something that we didn't really do much in this field, I think. And a lot of this resistance dynamic, its roots go back to inequalities and structural inequalities. So I'll stop at this point. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Isra, also for this pragmatic and realistic reminder of the complexity and the time frame that we need to look at to realize this shift, both in institutional behavior and approach, and dealing with some very complex inherent and political resistance. We have a lot of questions from our audience, which I will be channeling to you momentarily. But since we've talked about principles, I'll take a quick commercial break to invite you all to a launch event that we have on the 15th of December for the launch of the Principles for Peace initiative, where we will announce an international commission on inclusive peace. And the whole idea of this initiative is to be a collective and participatory effort to address some of the very fundamental flaws we talked about today in terms of the international community's approach to peace, and many of the issues that we've discussed that are inherent problems to our approach. It's a collective effort. A lot of the organizations who are active in this space are joining this effort, and it's supported by a core group of governments for now, but that number of governments is increasing. But currently it's supported by Sweden, Denmark, Switzerland, Netherlands, and also the Robert Bosch Foundation, but a number of additional countries also from the South are joining the initiative. I can't give too much away because the announcement of the commissioners is still under embargo until the 15th, but we will be announcing an impressive international commission of 12 members that bring together leaders who spearheaded peace, humanitarian, and development efforts in various capacities before, as foreign minister, peace activists, mediators, or parties to peace processes, or academics in the space. And they all pledged to us before we announced that they will be a listening commission that will launch a global consultative process, and that they will put all of their effort to ensure that they bring these voices and perspectives. So my invitation to you to join the launch, which you can find on the Interpeace website, is to join this movement and engage. And with this, I'll move to some of the questions that we have, and I'll just ask, because there are quite a lot of questions, so I'll ask the distinguished panelists just to write to me a little message to say which questions they would like to answer, but then I'll give you the floor. So the first question is around some of the common pitfalls that you've observed in your work regarding box ticking when it comes to inclusion, and if you have observed that. There's another question around, and it's much longer, and you can read it as well in the chat box, but the short version of it is that there has been a long discussions around inclusion for many, many years. What are the concrete steps to ensure radical changes in operationalizing the peace processes? So let's take these first two, and then I'll be going again with the second round. And perhaps, if I don't see who is taking the first question, so I'll go perhaps to you, Zand, and then we'll move to the next panelist. Zand? Alexander.
Yeah, I was just trying to click my mute button. Yeah, sure, I'm happy to have a go. So pitfalls, and what was the second one? Sorry.
You can take either some of the pitfalls or the second one, the concrete steps to ensure radical changes in operationalizing peace processes.
Okay, so a pitfall, a couple of pitfalls. Well, to plug our publication, I think one of the pitfalls is to leave inclusion completely till later. So I think you have to start thinking about inclusion early on, at the beginning. And for example, one way to do that is always to do your homework. You know, your analysis that you base your intervention on should be inclusive, gendered analysis. You know, if you're only analysing the armed groups and who holds the military power in terms of dealing with your intervention, then you're going to get one kind of outcome from that kind of analysis. So make sure you do your homework of what the different groups are, what the relationships are between them, who holds what type of power, who represents whom at a local level, national level, all the rest of it. And I think that, you know, Eve was talking about principles. That should be a sort of standard principle, that you have to do your homework and you have to keep doing it as you go through your intervention. So I think that was that should be something. And then just to talk a little bit about the sort of box ticking approach, and to talk about that in terms of length of time as well. I mean, one of the box ticking approaches is quotas, you know, putting in quotas for different amounts of representation from different types of community, which is kind of problematic. But Ezra, you were talking a bit about Nepal, which has done a lot of quotas. And I think for a long period of time in Nepal, the quotas were a bit sort of superficial. You got numbers of people into the Constituent Assembly, numbers of women or representatives of different ethnic groups. But maybe over time, that's kind of paid off a bit, actually, you know, and it takes, you know, inclusion isn't instant if it's in a society that has been very exclusive for a long period of time. You know, inclusion takes time to build up. People need to get used to it. It needs to go through lots of different political processes. People who are new to the political scene need to learn how the political scene works and how they can operate in it. Mm-hmm. And I think over a period of time, maybe that has become more inclusive in Nepal. And it's a hard fight. You know, Nepal has some difficult resistance to overcome in terms of inclusion, and some very powerful people in very sort of privately run ways of maintaining power that are very hard to break down. And what was quite interesting about Nepal, we have an article in our publication, not looking at Nepal actually, but talking about critical junctures in transitions and how you need to use those critical junctures, which might not just be the peace process, the peace agreement, there might be other ones. And that's where some sort of quick changes maybe happen in a society. And in Nepal is a classic example of the earthquakes a few years ago, and there was a real sort of race to see who could respond first. You know, the conservatives or the more progressive groups, and it wasn't a definitive outcome of it, but it was a moment when things really changed. You know, and I think one thing about the long-term approach is if you're ready for that moment, then you can act on it more quickly. So if you've been working with different groups, so they have more capacity, they are more engaged in the process, then it's harder then for more conservative groups to use that moment, which they will try to do, to sort of to embed their power. So then, yeah, a couple of responses.
Great, thank you very much, Alexander, for that. And I see that Eve, you would like to say something. So, but before I pass to you, I'll add a couple more questions from our audience, so you could reflect on these, and then we'll move also to Esra. I'm sure she has a lot to say to these various questions. One of the questions to all of the panelists is on the common grammar and language And the question is, what kind of literacy among peacemakers is needed or missing to integrate inclusion into peace programming, in addition to cultural literacy, for example? So that's one question. And another question, which is quite long, but it's a very, very important question, that we have seen a number of examples where a peace process is followed by a broader, hopefully more inclusive dialogue or other processes. For example, Sudan is trying to do that right now with the implementation of the Juba Peace Agreement and a planned subsequent National Governance Conference. What examples can you think of such multiple linked processes? Do you know of some that have been actually successful in increased inclusion subsequently to peace processes that perhaps were not as inclusive? So I'll park these two questions, go to you, Yves, and then to you, Isra.
Thanks. I just wanted to do one or two things. One, we didn't speak today about one of the things which I really think is preventing sometimes to have a real perspective when it comes to peace, which is military assistance. And I've seen that a lot in all the contexts where I've worked, how much the military assistance is a critical factor, and it's totally not transparent. So it's lovely. We are talking about transparency, about budget. We're trying to see the development element, the humanitarian. We're trying to bring that. And then there is a military assistance, and there is no connections whatsoever between, in a way, the peace and the development and the work done and the military assistance. So when there are connections, they're very rare. And we know now from information that in general, when we're talking about a lot of money, a lot of resources. So I don't know, roughly speaking, it's between 1 for the development and the peace to 10 for military assistance, and this is even lower element. So I think there is something about how do we understand the military assistance in a context, in a given context, who is giving the military assistance, and how much does that relate or not to a peace strategy. That is something which is never really talked about it, which I think is absolutely central. So just to respond to the people saying also what blocks, that is really a major for me element that blocks. On what to do, I think there is something also and I think Alexander mentioned that as a to-do, of course, understanding the power dynamic, understanding what the groups are and how it works. I think also for me, one of the elements is understanding what are the informal governance mechanisms in a context. There's always informal governance mechanism, right? I'm coming from a country, Switzerland, where there is a lot of things which are implicit in terms of governance mechanism. And if you don't get it, you can try to do whatever you want about peacemaking in Switzerland. That will be very difficult. So it sounds basic, but it's so clear. I'm now based in the US. There's a lot of things to say about also the informal dynamic and how it works. So I think understanding the informal mechanism and then being able to leverage on some of them again. That is possible again if you have a strategy over longer term. You can do that if you're not obsessed only by the cessation of hostility. I think that would be something interesting to be able to explore. That was just what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Esra.
Okay. Let me start with the last question, linking processes. I think it was Elizabeth's question. I think Veronique is also here. I see her in the participant list. I suggest that you look at some of her work in the sense on strategic inclusion or incremental inclusion. And I know they have a publication coming out soon on this, where they also discuss a lot of examples of how this incremental inclusion worked and under what conditions, where did it work, etc. So I think you will find that very useful. On the question of box ticking, I guess that's that's pretty much most of my research is about, right? It's even worse than box ticking because it's even worse than box ticking because what I'm really talking about is even worse than box ticking, right? That sometimes people, the elites, they say that, okay, they agree to this inclusive process or they agree to an inclusion agenda, but then they do all sorts of things to hamper this in disguised ways. I think this is even worse than box ticking. So I think, I mean, so I don't want to repeat what I said, but I mean, yes, that is happening. The other question on concrete changes to ensure concrete ideas to ensure radical changes. I mean, I guess I will say that in the long term, I don't think radical changes happen maybe in the short term, but we need to be also thinking about these dynamics, cultural, ideological dynamics in the long term that sustain an exclusive system, an exclusive society. I don't think it will be fair to expect a peace process to change this, as I said. But as Alexander said, I think it would be a great achievement if the peace process puts that country, puts that society in the right track towards the achievement of this transformation, an idea. So I think we need to be really thinking in terms of different time frames here. Short term, what is to be done about inclusion in the short term, in the negotiation phase, early on, even before negotiations, maybe pre-negotiation phase, the negotiation phase, and then in the implementation phase, and then later for more sustainable, inclusive societies. Right. The goal here is to achieve an inclusive society, and this is not a black or white either or an absolute thing. This comes in spectrums, degrees. Even in countries, societies that are not in conflict, it will be very difficult to say that they are completely 100% inclusive societies. This is always a process that is going on. It's an ongoing process. I mean, look at the discussion in the U.S., right? The last couple of months around issues of racism, for example, Black Lives Matter, etc. So it is a discussion in the U.S. as well, even though we don't consider U.S. as a conflict society or with violent conflict. But this is an ongoing transformation, ongoing process, and that's why I don't see certain steps taken and then a radical change achieved. I don't see it that way.
Great. No, thank you very much, Isra. Really nicely said to conclude our discussions, and I would like to thank all of you, our speakers, for your insights and thought-provoking contributions, but also to thank our audience who have been very active in sharing both their ideas, perspectives, reports, excellent publications, and very, very good and thoughtful questions. And also thanks to the PeaceCon teams. I heard very strong messages from our speakers, which I think will stay with us. I heard a strong urgency and imperative for action. That spirit was there from all your contribution. I heard a strong call for moving beyond short-termism and the importance of considering peace processes as long-term effort, spanning over several years, sometimes even decades, rather than focusing and directing our resources and energy to short-term solutions, which are also important, but need to be balanced with greater focus on implementation, oversight, and accountability. I heard a strong call that we need to be pragmatic and recognize that violence is the main currency and an important currency, but how urgent it is for us to understand the power dynamics and find ways to work around that reality and find alternative and complementarity in our approach to engage. I've heard a strong message that we need to be very explicit and intentional when it comes to inclusion, that we can no longer be satisfied with tokenism or limited inclusion, and we need to move to strategic inclusion, but also realizing that this has been on the agenda for a long time, and there's still a lot of hurdles and structural challenges that prevent us. But I also took a strong message around the need for common grammar and narrative. And I very much, of course, I believe that it's very important that we have that common grammar for peace and a frame of reference that would guide and serve how we move forward. So I thank you all very, very much for a wonderful discussion. It's been my pleasure to contribute to this discussion and facilitate it. And have a good afternoon and evening and night wherever you are. Thank you.